Well, Patrick, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to Austcham Shanghai and our members. I might just start with an easy one. Just tell us a little bit about the Australian Meat Industry Council, your role, and how the industry is currently faring in Australia.
Thanks, Jack, and look, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be talking to Austcham. It's certainly at a crucial time for our industry and obviously in regards to Australia-China relations. The Australian Meat Industry Council, we are the peak body in Australia for the post-farm gate meat supply chain. So that's processors, both domestic and export, red meat and pork processors. We represent also all of the major and SME small goods manufacturers in Australia as well. And at a domestic retail level, we have over 1,500 butchers that are our members. We also have a number of what we call non-packer exporters, or just export traders that are also our members. So we basically represent the make and the sell in regards to the red meat industry. I'm the CEO. My role, like most CEOs, can be many and varied depending on skill set and depending on who you have working for you. We have 3 different divisions here for our commodities. We are also heavily involved domestically on employment management issues, here. And obviously we have to look after all of our communications and member services that we undertake. So, but we've got a broad church of membership, but essentially we hold and run a very strong advocacy position for our certainly on our red meat export levels, and we're very strongly involved in China and have been over the number of years, and have just increased that over the last 18 months.
And can you tell me, Patrick, I mean, how is the industry? We can come to the issues in China that we've seen earlier this year and the importance of this market for your members and just export more broadly. But it's an interesting, I think, time to be involved in the production of cattle in Australia. How's the industry more broadly, through the back end of last year, pre the impact from COVID, and obviously looking ahead into 2020?
Yeah. So I think with certainly in regards to our industry at the moment, it's a very interesting time to be in food production. I think that we've, as an industry, got ourselves through that and to the other side of the pandemic issues exceptionally well, probably the best globally. Our production lines have actually increased. Our production output has increased. We've seen at a domestic level for our industry that in the previous 13 weeks, we've increased consumption in Australia by almost 30%. Now that will obviously plateau back out, but it's been very interesting here at a domestic level. Our retail butchers have been the ones who have given us the most, or have taken the most of that increase. So people are still looking to keep local and stay local because of obviously due to restrictions in movement, etc. More broadly, in a global sense, we're still calendar year, end of April, we're still 10% above where we were of the record year in 2019 for China, which is utterly unbelievable. That's basically occurred because of a very strong January, early February, pre-Lunar New Year. Now, as you and everybody else obviously knows, COVID really impacted in China around and during Lunar New Year, and that in turn ensured that where we are of strength, which is in food service and those sorts of key areas, has been shut down. Yeah. So there's a lot of product that's still in the marketplace. So whilst we had that very strong initial first 6-7 weeks in the year, obviously that has dissipated, but we're still sitting better than we were this time last year. Now we know that that's going to plateau out and potentially go somewhat backwards due to other issues, but look, China overall very strong for us. Japan and Korea, one up, one down. So, but in single digits as far as export levels are concerned. So they remained fairly stable during this during the pandemic the pandemic crisis. But the US, look, yeah, it is 15% down year on year, calendar end of April. We don't see that recovering anytime soon. Their supply chain has had massive, has massive failures in it, as insofar as product just getting through to the consumer. I think one interesting anecdote from that has been that that Wendy's, a very large burger chain globally, obviously, and including in China, but Wendy's burger chain in America proudly stands and says, we do not have Australian beef. We only use American beef. 20% of Wendy's chain stores in America, in the USA, have closed because they cannot get any beef. Now, that is just, literally unbelievable, thinking that would actually occur. So the beef supply chain in the US is in a terrible state at the moment. Employees have contracted COVID. President Trump has signed executive orders demanding or basically forcing processing facilities to remain open to keep food supply chains moving. So we've seen, that obviously cause great issues, and there's probably as many people working in the meat industry in the US who have contracted COVID than the whole of the Australian population that has contracted COVID.
Wow.
So it's just, it's simply unbelievable. So look, we've got, as I said, some headwinds in the short to medium term. Climatic conditions here in Australia have gone very well for our farmers in a lot of areas. So there's a reduction in supply. We're seeing throughput of cattle and sheep through sale yards, which is one of our only indicators here in Australia, that are back between 17 to 30% in throughput from this time last year. Whilst we're seeing feedlots full, that is starting to obviously there is now capacity space that's going to occur. Grain access for that product also is grain is getting more expensive coming into winter, but we forecast obviously with better climatic conditions more grain access and then more feeding of cattle. And obviously, as I've talked about, those other headwinds on that. So it's a complex but interesting time to be part of
it. Certainly complex and most definitely interesting. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about China and your experience over the years, just growing the export market. I know in my time living here on the ground, the idea of getting a piece of Australian meat or a steak at a high-end restaurant has only increased in both prestige, but also just the ability to buy it, frankly. It's amazing year on year how much more accessible it is in country, not just in the marquee cities like Shanghai. So perhaps you can just talk us through the growth over the last 5 or 10 years. Why are Chinese consumers so passionate about Australian beef, and how much are we selling right now?
Yep. So it is a fantastic story. I mean, on the beef front, amazingly, 10 years ago, 2010, I think we sent 5,000 tonnes of beef to China. 2019, it was 300,000 tonnes. Now, our cattle population is not, increasing in any great magnitude to supply that. It's fairly stable between 24.5 million to 27 million, and moves around in that sort of area. What has happened is been that China is willing to pay above global rates on many different cuts, on many different products, on many different from full sets, which is basically almost a whole carcass broken down, through to individual loin cuts and primal cuts, through to offal, other products around that, and obviously our commodity manufacturing products. So that is great, as well as our sheep meat production has grown as well. China's now our largest destination for sheep products.
Yep.
Certainly, probably over 100,000 tonnes of sheep meat product is going into China, both lamb and mutton. And look, there's a number of factors that have gone into that, the dramatic increases we've seen. Obviously plays a part since 2015 with the reduction in tariff schedules and moving around, going even down further than most favoured nation sort of structure. But there's also been very strong, almost a tripartite level between our own industry, our own members and those private businesses and companies doing their own branding, having their own offices, and getting out on the ground and doing their own business deals and aligning with Hermar stores, as an example, or going in with restaurant chains, or going in with food service or wholesale levels, or in fact working around different with different importers in just putting in putting in basic product. And that's the same with sheep meat, obviously, as well. So, at another end as well, on the marketing areas, we've seen obviously Meat and Livestock Australia, an office there in Beijing and Shanghai. That's given us more on the ground capacity in those marketing areas and co-branding that's been done. And then obviously us as AMIC, the Australian Meat Industry Council, tackling the more non-tariff issues, the technical base issues, aligning with our government here, managing the domestic structures that are required to get product up into China. And then we've grown that. We've done some very good work with KPMG on looking at a China trade relationship strategy. So what I was very keen on with our relationship with China certainly was post 2017, when 6 companies were out for 3 months due to technical issues, and no doubt, geopolitical relationship issues would have played a part in that. Post that, I just said, look, there's got to be a better way for us to be working with China as an industry.
Yep.
So Australia does things a little differently in some aspects. A lot of the negotiation and management and structure around market access and market access issues is done solely G2G, government to government. Whereas we look at and in our research, we looked at other industries around the world and found that mostly the industry does most of the work. And you would see that yourself with certainly US soy, US cotton, big offices in throughout China, big representations, big advancing and marketing in those areas. But then they then go back to their government and say, we have done this amount, we need your help to finish off in order to enhance market access or change metrics around non-tariff or technical matters, etc. We don't do that here. We do all of it through G2G. And if G2G starts to struggle, what is then our, how do we continue to progress those relationships? So we've done that. And in that enhancement, we've signed updated MOUs with the China Meat Association, as an example, with CCPIT, aligning with the the Chinese Chamber of Commerce in putting forward our non-marketing and non-business-to-business positions. And what I called it was really A to A, and that's association to association. So how do we link with the China Import Group? How do we link with people like CCPIT and others? How do we expand the relationship so it's just not a B2B process and hope to God that the brands work? It's more an Australian Inc. opportunity to give us the necessary footholds to then be able to answer questions and progress forward. Why? Because we've got a very clear, still on the table, 2017 joint agreement, which was signed by Li Keqiang and by Prime Minister Turnbull at the time, which very clearly pointed out where we needed to be in regards to our trading relationship. We still have 15 meat processing facilities here in Australia who are waiting to be, those establishments are waiting to be listed for China. And that in turn enhances their viability within Australia, keeps jobs going in Australia, because if China is paying above the odds for product, that in turn, we need to be making sure that everyone has those listings. And our difficulties then lie with the fact that our relationship geopolitically is better than most, is struggling. We're seeing thousands of establishments being listed for export to China, pork and poultry mainly in the US, through the US-China Phase 1 deal. Yep. We're seeing reciprocal rights occurring in Brazil, and even throughout the EU. So, we are really in a position where part of our advocacy message in China certainly has to be, as you pointed out at the start of this question, more people in China want to consume Australian product, and therefore we need to be making sure that there is more ability to and more availability of our product in China, and that's where we've got to be moving to. So again, pretty complex, but at a tripart level of business to business, government to government, and association to association, allows you the opportunity to be able to be tackling or eating the cow at one piece at a time.
There's no doubt that the work that the association level does is more important than ever. To add ballast, as they say, to the relationship, particularly given, I suppose, the environment we find ourselves in. So let's turn, perhaps, Patrick, to this year and the relationship with China and the industry more broadly. So obviously, we saw 4 large Australian beef plants exporting to China suspended. So my understanding were they looking after roughly about 1/5 of all of Australia's beef exports to the country. You touched on some of the geopolitical elements, but many have described this, along with impositions of tariffs on Australian barley, as something that's really outside the hands of individual exporters and potentially linked to much larger conversations at play. So perhaps you can just share with us, your experience when you heard about it, what you thought about it, how it compared to 2017, and how the industry responded.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Look, in 2000, obviously, personally, I was prepared when first it came to light, based on our experience in 2017. Also based on the fact that we've done so much work in that A-to-A relationship structure. We understood clearly how it operated at a G-to-G level, and we knew the exposures at a B-to-B level to know what we needed to say. I think this time around, as I've probably put, my team has put on social media, and including myself, is that it came at a very, very different time, and that ensured that next minute I was on every media channel in Australia. It was a huge issue very quickly. It needed to be noted that it occurred in timing at the same time, obviously, as the Prime Minister announced that he and his government, or our government, was keen to see a review of how COVID was created, how it started. And obviously, we've seen others within the government with our portfolio feeling free to, make their own assumptions around China, which obviously impacts on the relationship. We also saw the Chinese ambassador to Australia, which, we have a very good relationship as an organisation with the Chinese embassy. We saw that they that they went out themselves on the front foot, again, quite aggressively, and even included saying the famous quote now of, well, what if Chinese consumers stop consuming Australian beef? So that was a very strong media story, and as such, it was somewhat different, but we had that exposure. The key thing for us as an association was we just needed to ensure that the public record was correct in regards to how we managed this and what it looked like and the amounts that we were talking about and how our industry would be able to manage this. And what impact it would have on farmers. In Australia, farmers are viewed very, very passionately. It's a very trustworthy industry within our community. They'd seen how we had progressed in providing product onto the Australian market in regards to COVID-19, and how we'd stepped up to the plate, pardon the pun, and provided, all of a sudden meat became a non-discretionary spend in Australia. So there was also that area of protecting that. And, the usual things that you get with China here in Australia at the moment, from a right-wing media standpoint, from a left-wing media standpoint. So that, all of those then ensured that we also needed to be clear what the view was in China here. And that's where our association to association structure helps. But we also learned some lessons as well. I mean, I think that I think for any business, any association, any group, be they giants like the mineral industry through to smaller and upcoming groups outside of food processing in China, one of the things is we may be signing MOUs and we may be, strong in our positioning and our relationship, but there's also probably a tendency for Australia to overemphasise the opportunity that an MOU may have to defend Australian, not Australian rights, but I would probably say more Australian opportunity in China. Yep. And I think that if we then looked and said, okay, well, we got an MOU with you, you need to pack your bag, get to the front door of the Forbidden Palace in China and stand there and fight for us, that we know, that's not going to happen. So we need to be looking at how does that A-to-A relationship then help both parties, because obviously an inability for product to get to China hurts importers. Importers, hurts those jobs, hurts those supply chains. But whilst in Australia we have more ability to be able to get up and scream from the rooftops and use media to that advantage, China does not have that opportunity. So I think that the key areas, again, we need to look at is that whilst we reserve the right in a relationship on a geopolitical level to be able to question decision-making and question certain principles and activities that occur in a country which we may not agree with. At the same time, I don't think as well that we also should be under an expectation that an MOU means that we've got a defender in a country. I think that we've got to be relaxed, and I think that that's what we've certainly learnt through this time. And now, all the information has been collected by the Department of Agriculture on the corrective action reports and everything else, and that will be with China just the same as we did in 2017. And we then await the China review on that and what the next steps will be.
And see how we go. Can you talk us through, Patrick? There's a bit of, I must say, mixed information about what exactly the issue is or was with the 4 abattoirs and their, I suppose, permission to export to China. Can you just give us some information? It's been described as very technical. Just in your mind and talking with those abattoirs directly, what they've been advised of and what they need to provide or to show to be back on the, the green channel to export again.
Yep. Look, very succinctly and basically, China has a tolerance, and they report on these tolerances publicly through the GACC website, which talks about a range of issues that they find at port, which relates to exporting. So other countries around the world, very much on the public record, we see things. We see other countries who are being pulled up and reported on for sending rotten meat. And we see other countries around the world who are providing damaged cartons and things of that nature. We're a manufacturing industry. We probably send 65 million cartons plus to China every year. And in that, often in any manufacturing facility in the world, no matter how good, you are not getting 100% compliance rates in regards to positioning of labels or the alignment of labels to manifests, and there are always certain idiosyncrasies that occur. So China's, and as you know, and no doubt as people listening to this broadcast would know, in China, that at the different ports that we go to, there are different jurisdictions that actually operate those, and the prefectures that look after them. So sometimes some prefectures as well, even through GACC, have different levels of tolerances. Now, bulk of ours goes through Shanghai, and as such, within that group and that cohort and their alignment to GACC, they have a different tolerance to other markets, other ports that we may go to. So inevitably what's occurred is that they undertake random sampling. Sometimes they sample everything. And as such, if they feel as though that in that tolerance level that they're concerned, then they obviously flick a switch, as they've done to all different countries all around the world for all different types of issues. They put a temporary suspension on those businesses, and they do that. Now, this is very different to Bali, because Bali is a tariff-rated issue on everybody.
Yep.
This is a suspension for individual businesses, and we've seen it just recently in regards to an atypical BSE outbreak in Ireland, where these little things are going to pop up. I think the animal was almost 20 years old. So when these things pop up, guess what? China has banned Ireland, period. So, whereas again, this is a specific business issue. So we have to remain vigilant, but at the same time, I have to say that certainly for our overall membership and as an industry as a whole, you've also got to look at now that this is the second time this has occurred like this in less than 3 years. And I think our industry is also looking at the risk mitigation and risk management involved in sending product to China, and again, probably taking the necessary precautions, because our compliance rate is 99.98% into China in regards to this. So, look, timing is everything, as they say, and no doubt there are other factors at play here, which is well above my pay grade, and certainly well above my my level of security clearance. So that's what happens. But that's why we continue to advocate that trade is not collateral damage when we are working on those geopolitical issues. And it's not saying at all that we need to be enslaved by a market or anything like that. This is purely and simply about ensuring that we recognise that we've done a lot of work in that market, and we've done a lot of work to provide those products, and we are proud of the structures and the products and the systems that we have in place to do that. And it includes the Australian system, the Australian standard for processing of red meat, and it includes a whole range of different things. So these are just areas in trade that occur from time to time. And look, we also have many different technical trade issues that we have to manage globally. It's not just China. It's just China's the biggest.
Of course, not just China, and that's just one to manage in a very big global complex environment. Patrick, I'm interested to just hear a bit more about this year versus perhaps 2017. And you spoke, I think, very well just in terms of the association to association level, the importance of, I think, creating more of a conversation with industry, not just individual companies doing business with buyers or distributors in market. Are you talking with the government, obviously, on a regular basis? Are you asking or calling for anything to be different from the Australian side in your dealings with the Minister, with DFAT, with the Department of Agriculture from a technical perspective? Is there anything tangible that you're looking or wanting to be changed? Are you looking at changes to the free trade agreement over time? Is there anything in your advocacy messages that have come up from what we've been through this year?
Oh, look, probably last question first. Certainly no changes in regards to JAFTA in any time soon. I mean, as you know, that there's now the 5-year review on JAFTA, so we'll be making a strong submission there. But certainly nothing, no changes with this outcome, especially. And I think that's because a lot of these free trade agreements are about tariff schedules, and if quotas are available. So, example, the EU FTA that we're working on, the Australia EU FTA, clearly it's our last market in the world that has a quota. So, and the quota structure around that. So, and that's not going anywhere. So it's about how do we effectively get the best deal in that area. But it doesn't take away from any of the technical market aspects that we have to undertake. So a lot of times, if we look at the Middle East or any of our halal markets, so the Middle East, Malaysia, Indonesia especially, the areas and structures around halal change all the time, and they do cause us angst and concern in having to not just meet them, but in fact probably more appropriately having to sometimes defend the current standard that we have. In regards to where we are between 2017 and now, as in regards to China, what we're talking about with the Australian government, look, we've done, and we've got a great relationship with David Littleproud, Minister for Ag, and certainly with Simon Birmingham as Minister for Trade, and he has bent over backwards to hear our issues and understand what they are and defend our positions. What we are saying to both of them at the moment is that the call for diversification as a risk mitigation tool probably in our view is somewhat, it can be viewed somewhat naively. And the reason being is because that, as we've talked about previously, we can't send the types of products that we send to China somewhere else because one is that potentially they don't want it, two, they can't afford it, or through a combination of both. So, so we've got to talk to them about the rhetoric around diversification. And really what we're looking at is diversification can only occur with a further breakdown in technical market issues. And we're not backwards in coming forwards about not just defending, but working on how that might look. So certainly from our point of view, the relationship with our ministers remains strong. Obviously, we know that there are people out in the backbench, and look, we've been public around that in regards to the backbench that they have a very strong position. But as AMIC, we're working with people beyond that. We're working with the major advisory firms. We're working with some of the different China groups that are out there. We're working with groups like Asia, the Asia Society, trying to get an understanding of two. One is obviously a dominant player within Asia, but secondly, looking at ASEAN and what is coming into the future. Where are we with India? What is going to happen to that in the future, especially for sheep meat? So I think that we've got a lot of those things continually progressing forward in our trade agenda, as well as looking after our domestic market. But I think that certainly from a China perspective, we do have a strong relationship with our government. We recognise what's going on with the backbench and that positioning that's occurring. Is it helpful for trade? Look, publicly, I'll tell you, absolutely bloody not. But are we in fact going to sit there and allow those individuals to potentially believe they're representing trade in Australia? No, we're not. So we work with the right ministers in the government. We ensure that we understand and respect the positioning geopolitically of our government, because certainly from a trade perspective, it's not trade's right to walk in and just say, oh, look, by the way, issues in relation to the South China Sea, issues in relation to Xinjiang province, issues in relation to, as I said, to management of Uyghurs COVID-19, universities in Australia, cyber issues, etc., and security, obviously, we just can't walk in and say, oh, we trump all those because we're trade. What we've got to be doing is saying, we can't be collateral damage in this. Where is the middle ground that we can sit and stand on in order to do that? Because certainly from a backbench perspective, it's bloody dead easy to just sit there and say, we don't like China and that's the end of it. Because there's no responsibility and no accountability to back to certainly either the states that certain senators represent, or in fact any of the areas that the MPs represent with their constituents. And so that's the balancing act, and it's never quite easy.
You're definitely walking the fine line, but no doubt that is the messaging. I mean, we as an organisation have been saying for a number of years that political rhetoric or political commentary most definitely does impact trade, and a number of the key issues that have come up across the last 3 or 5 years, often there is an example from the conversation in Australia that has changed the way the relationship has been received in China, and that's challenging.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really around broadening an understanding of what is in the national interest, and also reminding, I think, stakeholders that jobs and livelihoods depend on a healthy and vibrant trading relationship with China. So no doubt that for yourself and your industry, that's right across the country. That is literally in every pocket of our continent. The work that they do on a daily basis, pushes us all forward.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think that it's not easy for a government to be dealing with an economy of our size versus an economy of theirs, but more importantly, what our economy is structured around. So, and it's simple to say that we're too reliant on them, but from a meat industry perspective, it's not that we're too reliant on them. In a meat industry's perspective, what's happened is that we've allowed the growth of our industry to be aligned to the growth of China. So we've changed product mix and we've changed market mix in order to lend into that. But as I said, that again, one of the key points and clear platforms that we have set in regards to our China Trade Group, which I'm the chair of, has been very simple. And that is a joint agreement and a joint statement was signed in 2017. We have 15 establishments that are still waiting here. That will encourage and enhance the opportunity, if we need to diversify, that we can. Because essentially, the more opportunity for more people to play a part in China increases competition and allows for the opportunity to then have, it's not just about sending another 100,000 tonnes. It could be the same, but the amount of alignment or reliance from certain companies on that it could be less. So instead of having 40 companies that are sending 30% of their product, it could be 60 companies sending 20% of their product. So we're not looking at that strategically enough. And so having those extra people at 15 companies only, when in the US, China, phase 1 deal, they registered over 1,000 establishments in a very short space of time in pork and poultry and to a lesser extent beef. So we're showing that there is credible evidence that the relationship is suffering because we're not able to move on from something that was actually signed. We're not able to move forward with that. And so that's got to be clear evidence that there's obviously an issue. And that is what we are advocating for. With that opening up, with the allowance of those 15 establishments, it mightn't seem like very much, and also for everyone to be registered for chilled, and also for every one of those establishments to be able to send tripe. Everyone might think, well, who cares about tripe? Well, it's a very consumed product in China, and China is willing to pay a strong price for that. So as I said at the very start, Jack, we are inverse manufacturers, and we're the biggest exposed manufacturing industry now in Australia because we take a whole and we then create parts. One of those parts is tripe. that part needs to be sold somewhere. And the more ability we have to, sorry?
Hot pot restaurants across the country.
Absolutely. And the more ability we have to be able to underpin the value of that livestock and actually ensure and underpin margin from a processing and export perspective, then lends itself to then underpinning farming and our farmers into the medium to long term. So that is the negotiation position that we have. But we're not foolish in thinking that, oh, well, because if you look at, as you'd know, mineral exports just, dominates in that. But exports of agricultural product are growing, and it's a growing area. And so managing that market mix is certainly something. But if we have to manage that market mix, you've got to recognise that then there's less income. And if there's less income, that puts a downward impact on the economy. It puts a downward impact on rural and regional economies especially, and it puts a downward impact on jobs. So if we're willing to ensure that taking geopolitical stances and knowing the impact and seeing the evidence of a deterioration in our relationship, then in fact, well, then you're doing that with your eyes wide open, and you must then, you must take the outcomes, with expectation. And those people that are calling for those sorts of changes in the relationship need to be accountable and responsible for that.
Mm. Can I ask you just further on that, Patrick? And it's probably a more delicate question, but the conversation at the moment seems to now move beyond the idea of diversification in some quarters, and the idea being that exporters or individual Australian brands should, have a little bit of nervousness around their exposure to the market. What is the sentiment in, your membership? So those either making or selling in market around the idea that perhaps Chinese consumers may look elsewhere, the idea that meat from other parts of the world is becoming more freely available in China, or to your point, that now there's more exporters licensed in other parts of the world with perhaps an easier track over time to grow their market share here. Are people worried about protecting market share or protecting the value proposition of Australian beef?
Of course, Australian beef and sheep meat, as I said, there are certain parts that we sell to China that are willing to pay far in advance of other markets around the world. And that's because, a number of key issues that we've seen over the past 12 to 18 months, African swine fever, COVID-19, the willingness for consumption, the US-China trade war that's now turned into the phase 1 deal, getting access to product overall. We are the most valuable red meat exporters globally. We're only the 4th in volume, certainly on beef, but we're the most valuable. And that's because people see the quality of the product and are willing to pay the price that is put forward. So, of course, exporters are nervous about how this is progressing. Of course, exporters are looking at this saying, well, how do we mitigate this risk? How do we manage it? How do we manage our exposure? But overall, we've also been encouraged by the same government over previous iterations of government and of this of previous administrations to be selling product into China. Yeah. So, there is a case where we're driven through one position. It's, just like if anyone's seen people driving sheep through gates. We're driven through one gate, then all of a sudden we're asked to turn back and go back through another one. Sheep are pretty hard to turn around once they're moving forward in a certain direction. So just by telling us now you've got to go back through another direction because this is the way the relationship is, it's not as simple as that. So I think that's some of the concern that our members have, and that is, how do we effectively turn around and go through the other gate because we're being whistled at to go through another gate and the dog's barking at us to go through another gate, but essentially there's so many of us coming forward and there's so much of it coming forward. That's the nervousness that continues to go through our industry. But we are still seeing strong we're still seeing strong sentiment towards Australian product. We're still seeing strong sales views. We're still seeing people who are wanting to take more. We're seeing the doju economy, online sales. All of these structures are still there and growing, and people are wanting Australian product to go through that. So, as I said, there are many varied balancing acts that people are going through, and the more that we see Chinese companies coming back to us saying, we're looking for more product, we're looking for these types of products, we're looking to sell it through these different methods and process. But at the same time, Australian companies going, well, I've got to limit my exposure to a certain amount because, God forbid, that another senator from Victoria, as an example, is out there smashing China again over university acceptances, or the fact of China influence in our industry. Then they're having to make these decisions. So sooner or later, China will stop potentially coming forth to us and saying, we're looking for your product, because they in turn will look at us as a risk. Because if they're not seeing us as being risk takers, which our industry has been for 150 years or more in domestic, and then being, this is the 50th anniversary of containerized meat exports out of Australia.
Yeah.
So our forefathers and their forefathers have built this industry to where it is today, and have led the world in innovation and market access and negotiations and FTAs, that all of a sudden at 2020, that we want to then say, actually now we want to regress. It's that balancing act, because I don't think this government wants to regress. David Littleproud and Simon Birmingham have certainly been ardent in their defence of our industry, but also in the defence of the work that's been done in China and our relationship within China. So clearly what we've got to then say is, are we willing to risk it? How much do our principles, how do we structure principles versus trade? Because obviously principles need to come first in a relationship, and I don't think any of our members would disagree with that. So therefore, if we're looking at our principles and we know that we've got trade, and we know that we've got leverage into that market, and we know that we've got an industry that's growing, the National Farmers Federation and David Littleproud are strident in their support that agriculture needs to be a $100 billion industry in Australia by 2030, and the biggest industry in that is meat. So, all of those things have to play a part. And then when you're sitting there as a growing business, as a non-packer exporter sitting in an office, trading product and building relationships globally, you don't want to be in a position where potentially the most lucrative market is the one where you're trying to stay away from.
No, I don't think that's going to be the situation. This part of the world is really going to be potentially the only part of the world that grows strongly, at least for the next months or so. So the relationship couldn't be more important, and the demand for quality Australian products is not going to go away. So the sentiment should be one of growth, with a balanced conversation about everything else you mentioned.
Yep, most definitely.
Patrick, before we close, I just want to ask you briefly about your experience with China. So obviously pre-pandemic times, how often are you here? How do you engage with your stakeholders and your peers in the market? You mentioned earlier that it is a lot around refocusing a China strategy for the industry. You mentioned also the associations that you deal with and who you sign arrangements with. What does that look like for you in a given week or a given month in normal times?
Well, yeah, look, I'm certainly up in China a few times a year. It's mostly towards the end of the year. It's linked to China Meat Association's global conferences that they hold. I've certainly been to both of the CIIEs that have occurred in November. As an industry, both from a partnership level with Austrade and Taste Australia, so that's Meat and Livestock Australia, Horticulture Australia, Dairy Australia, and obviously Wine Australia. That that we've got a fairly strong presence there, and then individual members have a strong presence there as well. So We also work with our MOU partners when we're up there. So look, yeah, and that association structure, getting a number of meetings, seeing what the issues are, meeting with a few times a year with head of mission at the embassy, getting an idea of where they see relationships and key points that we want to progress forward with them. So, from an export market perspective, we used to just allow our members to do everything. And, I think certainly over 50 years, we've worked in specific markets and then sort of moved backwards from that. So America is one where we were, and we still are, very well aligned to the Meat Importers Council of America. But now it's more our individual businesses that are aligned to them as members rather than us as a whole. Secondly, we've got Japan, and again, it's become more a B2B area. Korea, we had a very strong presence there, and then back to that B2B level. So, and we have new markets and new dawns that we're looking at, ASEAN, especially Indonesia, and where the Middle East is moving to is often a sense of conjecture, but essentially, it is a growing market, and certainly on an air freight level is just been enormous. So we're going to continue to be working across this because, interestingly, whilst it's a exceptionally ancient civilization and a very strong and been at the forefront of economies for most centuries.
Yeah.
China's still a fairly immature market in a lot of circumstances for us, considering, as I said, 10 years ago, we only sent 5,000 tonnes of beef there. Mm-hmm. So things have moved very quickly. We've always been in the market, but things have moved very quickly. And therefore, and they continue to move quickly, and more people are going there. More smaller exporters are going there. More people see more opportunity and getting more exposure. And we're seeing that China leads the world in a lot of innovative techniques to get to consumers. A burgeoning, pre-COVID, a burgeoning food service market. And no doubt that will start to re-energise itself again. But an ability for a country to be also selling product at a retail level as well. So there's still much growth and much opportunity there we see in China, and we're just going to continue to tread the paths in order to ensure that we can and do it differently. So not just go to an industry association, talk to the Chinese, the International Chinese Chamber of Commerce, those sorts of people who potentially never really, industry groups never really went near. But getting outside the comfort zone and really having some interesting discussions, which is what we've been doing.
Good. Well, there couldn't be a more important time for both the industry and the work that you do. Patrick, I just want to thank you for speaking to myself and Austcham Shanghai and our members. It's been great to talk through what you are dealing with, what is a very interesting time and a fascinating year. We wish you all the best in terms of the current live issues on your plate, but also, of course, just growing and strengthening the relationship with China. So thanks for making the time.
Thank you, Jack. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much.